All right, today we'll be reacting to the Joe Rogan Experience, powerful JRE, and he has on our science guy. Not Bill Nye, the science guy. I wish. That would bring back some very fond memories. But it's Neil deGrasse Tyson, another huge communicator in the science and, of course, astrophysics space. So let's get into it.
So, what has changed in terms of our understanding? The Webb has been in the million-mile orbit, or however far away it is, for how long now?
Well, it got there, and then we did some engineering. So I guess a year and a half. Yeah.
And what has changed in our understanding?
So that's been people's first question, and what I want to do is temper that
I believe they're referring to the James Webb Telescope.
to say something a little different. So yes, we expect James Webb to make great discoveries. We expect that, but the first
Yes,
order
we
of
do.
business is hardly ever, let's discover something new today. It's, here's something that we have limited understanding of. Let's improve on that.
First thought, what's something that you guys would like to see right off the bat? If you had the James Webb Telescope, you can get it to navigate anywhere in the cosmos. What would be the first? I think a hot topic there are the aliens. They've got to be out there, right? That would definitely be one of my first picks, but let's see what they're diving into here.
And in so doing, we deepen our understanding of how things work in the universe. That doesn't always involve overturning a previous idea or discovering something that nobody ordered. All right? That will happen. We fully expect that to happen. But we targeted parts of the sky initially because we know other telescopes have gone there before. And we're going to say, how can we further advance and deepen our understanding? One thing it's going to be able to do, and it has already done, we have, you know how many exoplanets there are? And I don't know how many of your audience was born.
Do you know how many exoplanets there are? I don't. Got to be tons. Um, Really interesting here, though, is I feel like there's so many questions around why are we funding space. There's so many things that we could be funding here, which I do agree. There's so much that we could be solving here as well. Hopefully, we can do that in tandem. But one thing that is important to mention in the space community, at least, as to why it's important to get the telescopes out there, to get robots, let's say, out there to be able to navigate waters, not waters, space, literally, that we are unable to traverse ourselves, is the fact that it gives us new vantage points. Because all of our telescopes, everything that we use is just from the vantage point of Earth. So imagine being able to go to another planet, imagine being able to go to another system that allows us to see things from a new perspective, from a different angle, which can then give us a better idea of what life really is, like where life forms even really are, and what that means for us.
After 1995, how many 27-year-olds and younger?
Probably quite a few.
Quite a few. Okay. So I will take this opportunity to knight them.
90s babies.
Generation exoplanet.
Ah, I see what you did there.
1995 was the first exoplanet discovered, a planet orbiting another star. And I'll never forget that because it was my first time on national television. I was freshly minted as director of the Hayden Planetarium in New York City. And NBC sent New York City is the media news headquarters, right, of all the networks. So NBC sent an action cam. They interviewed me because of my title, not because they knew or gave a crap who I was. My title was director of the planetarium. And so I gave my best professorial reply. The Doppler shift, this is how it's discovered and what we do and how we measure it. And I was describing the fact that when you discover these planets, you don't actually see the planet. It's the effect of the planet's gravity on the host star. And so if you watch the host star like jiggles, okay, just a little bit in response.
Supposedly, if I'm not mistaken, they do the same thing with being able to identify black holes. It's of course not the black hole themselves they're looking at, it's how the light bends around it and how the light of the planets are moving around when they pass through a potential black hole area. So it's the light that of course, it's all that we see is light, but that's what we're trying to capture for. It's not the image itself. I find that really interesting, especially when you think of different concepts of relativity. And if you're familiar with the Bob Lazar episode, he talked about how it has the potential to move gravity and bend light. So what distortions are we seeing in that light that are reflective of what's happening and those that aren't? I'm no physicist. I just think that these are interesting concepts to delve into question, regardless if you're into the scientific arena or not, because I think that, because we're all human, we all deserve a chance to be able to pick at these types of questions and see what life is and nature, for example.
To the planet going back and forth around it. So you're measuring the stars. So I motioned that like with my hips. And that evening on the evening news, that's all they showed was me jiggling my hips. I said, oh my gosh. Okay, that's how you're going to do this. Okay.
Neil deGrasse has
You don't
hips
want me
like
to be
Shakira.
Professor Neil. You want me to be soundbite Neil. All right, so from then on, I practiced my sound bites. And a soundbite's like 3 sentences.
Oh, so you recognize that this is the format now.
Correct.
That would have been a
And I
huge meme.
said, I can't just give them my stump speech as a professor of astrophysics. It has to work in their medium. And so I went home and stood in front of the mirror and had people just shout out things to me, anything in the universe, any idea, object, person, place, or thing. And I would come up with like 3 sentences that are interesting, make you smile, and be tasty enough to want to tell someone else the anatomy of a soundbite. So try it. Say anything in the whole universe.
How do we know how?
No, just one word.
Say anything. Anything that comes to mind right now. Part of the universe. What comes to mind? Exoplanets.
Just
Okay.
say anything.
The Big Bang.
Big Bang.
Ooh.
Ooh. The birth of space-time energy and everything we know and love about this universe occurred 14
Joe's
billion
face.
years ago, and we have no idea what happened before it. And we're still expanding, as we will forever.
I read an article.
That's my soundbite for
That's
the Big
good.
Bang.
It's a good soundbite.
Yeah.
I read an article about the Webb telescope, and what they were taking into consideration is the possibility that the Big Bang may be incorrect, and that the universe might be larger and older than we think.
So,
Before Neil gets into this, a quick note. First of all, what do you think about the concept of infinity? I find that quite incomprehensible, even though you could just look at it as a tangent that just goes straight through indefinitely, infinitely, of course. But the odd concept of infinity is we don't know what we're expanding into because we understand things in terms of bounds and limits. When we think of us expanding infinitely, it's like expanding with respect to what beyond it. And infinity may not have bounds. Of course, in the mathematical realm, there are different types of infinity. Like an infinity, for example, can be larger than another based on the group that encompasses that type of infinity. But what a quick example of that there are when you look at, let's say, odd numbers. If all numbers are infinite and then you pair odd numbers to the total amount of numbers that there are, the total amount of numbers that there are is a greater infinity than that of just the odd numbers themselves, which also extends onto infinity. So it's just how we conceptualize and organize these topics. But more so in the philosophical realm, when we look at time and you question things such as what happened before the Big Bang. I remember, I think it was Brian Greene, another physicist who was on Joe Rogan. I believe, yeah, it was Joe Rogan quite a while ago, and he talked about the concept of time with respect to the Big Bang. And what's so interesting about what he said is that he said maybe the fact that we could try to conceptualize time before the Big Bang is almost a futile attempt to acknowledging time as a constant at all, because perhaps the way that the molecules were configured at the Big Bang is what permitted time to exist itself. And then you think of like, okay, well then what happened before that? But maybe it doesn't even play the same game. And this is an ongoing question that many thought leaders just aren't able to take a grasp on. And what is it that's going to be able to validate that for us? I think that's even the greater question is what is the sense of empirical evidence that would allow us to understand that time had preceded the Big Bang, or that there was something else there that was of another nature, of another constant of the universe, another law, let's say. So many vast questions when you get into the unknown, but let's hear what he has to say.
I hesitate to ask what pages on the internet you hang out on.
It was a
Okay.
legit. It wasn't saying the
Uh-oh.
universe is older. It's
Yeah.
saying as more data and new information comes in, there is a distinct possibility that the Big Bang might just be it just might explain the reach of the technology and not the actual scale of the universe itself.
Okay, so the way to think about this
That's
is,
fair.
and this is the way
Yes, I think that's fair, but I don't think that we can use that as a cop-out because there are a lot of times where we dive into these abstract questions and we say, oh, well, we just don't have the tools or the technology for it and just throw it onto the back. And I don't think that that's an adequate way of approaching the question. We need to understand the tools we already have and further question in completely new ways. This is why questions are so important because they allow us to think about things in completely new ways and have completely new applications that we might not have thought about before. And when you think of, okay, well, we don't have the technology for it, and yes, that's valid from an empirical standpoint, but what are the questions that are going to allow us to build the technology in the right way? Because technology isn't necessarily just a linear expansion. Yes, it gets evolved over time, and if you follow the Moore's law and subscribe to that concept, which is very valid in many ways as well, that you have a doubling of capacitors and therefore exponential rise in technology, but it's not always just a line going forward. We have hiccups in technology, we have falters, we have wrongdoings, but this is all part of the testing process. There's like the scientific method also applies to building technology itself. So what are some of the questions that you have that allow us to possibly in the future create new technology to understand what time is? Is it an AI? Is it a new type of robotic, let's say, being that those are prevalent in today's society? Who knows? But I think it's the questions that'll allow us to better understand how to build technology in the future. So that's why these conversations are so important.
Science has worked since basically the year 1600, where Galileo sort of starts codifying what people knew probably should be happening, but no one really did it in large scale. If you have an idea about something, then you test it multiple ways and get other people to test it. And if the tests give you consistent results, you have a new understanding of the universe. When that happens, that knowledge of the universe doesn't go away. It doesn't get undone. What happens typically is you have a deeper understanding of the universe in which that understanding gets embedded.
Mm.
And you realize that you only understood a small part of a larger whole. But the small parts you did understand, where you had multiple experiments that confirmed it, that doesn't change. So the cleanest example of this, and I'll get back to your question, is Newton's laws of motion and gravity. Did anyone see anything move faster than a galloping horse in his day? Probably not. And so
They had UFOs back then. Come on, right? But also, that's really tricky. He, of course, knows so much more about this than I do, but something that I would like to ask him is how do they know which information to discard when they do come up with a new discovery? Is it solely when it completely counteracts previous evidence? How do you know which information to pile on to then come up with new conclusions and to be able to write a new hypothesis about the next innovation, the next idea? And yeah, that's something I'd really like to know more about is how they weed out the old topics and which ones they tend to keep in.
the Newton's laws of motion and gravity worked. They worked not only for galloping horses, it worked for the moon in orbit around the Earth, and the Earth in orbit around the sun.
You're a real one if you know about the apple falling on Newton's head. I heard that that might not have actually happened, but hey, pretty interesting nonetheless.
Jupiter's moons in orbit around Jupiter, all right, and for the planets. So, okay, but wait a minute, it doesn't work for Mercury. Mercury's orbit is not following Newton's laws. Is there something wrong with the data? Let's check it. Data's correct. Oh my gosh, what's happening? Einstein comes along and says, I have a new understanding of gravity and a new understanding of motion. And it accounts for this weirdness in Mercury's orbit.
What was the weirdness?
Its shape was not exactly what Newton's laws of gravity would give you. Its shape could only be accounted for when you throw in Einstein's theory of general relativity. Why? Because the sun's gravity is so monstrous and Mercury's orbiting close enough to it.
100 years and general theory of relativity is still one of the major pillars of physics today, and then it has some conflicts with string theory, of course, but that is not completely verified. And then there's quantum entanglement, quantum physics. So peculiar, so odd.
that it's being influenced by extra phenomenon going on in the universe that's the product of very high and significant gravity. And so then do we throw Newton out the window? No, actually. You know what Newton's laws are?
Don't
They're
throw
what
Newton out the window. He's a
Einstein's
good
laws
guy.
look like when you put in low speeds and low gravity. If you put in low speeds, they become Newton's laws. In that limit, Newton's laws don't stop working where they used to work. Apollo to the moon used only Newton's laws because Einstein didn't matter at those scales. The moon and Earth and rockets, we're not going fast enough for any of that to matter. But when you start going fast enough, you cannot use Newton's laws. You have to use a deeper understanding. Now, where does Einstein take us? You go into the center of a black hole, you get black holes from Einstein. Center of black hole, there's a singularity. All the theories say the matter occupies zero volume, thereby having infinite density. And that's kind of weird. What? No, you can't have infinite. No. That's a limit.
That's what I think exactly. What? Come on. It just sounds so odd.
Of Einstein's theory. That's where it breaks down. It's some joke. That's where God divides by zero. Remember in math class, you can't divide by zero.
Right.
It's not defined or not allowed. So in Einstein's equations, we're dividing by zero at the singularity. So we all know that as brilliant as Einstein was, and as successful as his general theory of relativity has been, it has limits. And one limit is the center of a black hole, and another limit is the very birth of the universe itself. Getting back to your question, the Big Bang. So we have top people.
When you look at that dynamic there between the issues revolving around the black hole, and again, just to preface, not at all a physicist, these are just here simply to ask some questions, to dive into new realms of thought. But when you look at that, immediately what comes to mind is when you see that there's an issue so far with how we understand physics between the black hole and Big Bang, one of the common denominators between that is time. So I feel like we don't understand how to conceptualize time because time necessitates space, because for there to be time, you need to be moving through space as far as we're concerned. And if, as Neil deGrasse Tyson said, no volume, there's a singularity at the black hole, it also implies no time. But then what does that mean when you have infinite density? Is it infinite time? I don't know. My mind just doesn't know where to go with this. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about what you think. I'd love to hear what you have to say about where you think time plays a role when it comes to black holes and the Big Bang. Maybe those answers of time will give us a better understanding of both of those phenomena and possibly answer so many questions that we've had a dire need to for so long.
Working on trying to resolve this singularity problem. And in so doing, you get to some ideas that, well, maybe our Big Bang, because the Big Bang is not going to go away. All the data support this. So now I've got this Big Bang thing, okay? And, well, is this embedded in something bigger? Ooh. So when you put like quantum physics and general relativity and you try to come up with some bigger understanding, deeper understanding, string theorists have been all into this, you get a multiverse. We didn't pull that out of our ass. That came out of the equations. So how old is the multiverse? I don't know. It's definitely older than our universe because it birthed our universe and it births other universes and it births, the way the equations drive it, an infinity of universes.
See, that seems to be the answer that we have so far, is what is our universe expanding into, or at least a part of? It seems to be interconnected with some sort of multiverse. Now, conceptually, I think that can make sense. I think when we start implementing I think when we start associating that with parallel universes, in that, let's say I'm existing right now doing this, but wearing another colored sweater, for example, and that's happening an infinite amount of times, or you're watching this in an infinite parallel reality, I don't know if that's the direction of the answer, because I feel like that's such a human answer. And a lot of this goes even back to free will when it comes to if things are determined, if these things have played out already in other multiverses, and if we are determined in that way, but we don't really even understand what constitutes a choice itself. Because what is a choice? Is it me just waving my hand right now? Is it something that's a pivotal decision? Is it something that's a pivotal decision that changes the trajectory of my life? And if so, is that constantly branching out? And if it is, it seems like such a very human action unless you really are accounting for a full infinity, and that has to do with everything, like a leaf blowing in the wind, like a snarl of an animal. Anything that happens ever can automatically be branched out into infinite realities. And I'm just not sure because I feel like that's almost too much chaos, right? Maybe not. What do you think?
This is the idea that maybe there's a version of us in another
Yeah.
where I'm bald and you got the afro,
Here we
and
go.
but everything else is the same.
And also a version where everything's the same.
Where everything would be the same. Yes,
Everything you've ever said has been said before exactly in the same order.
correct. There's no reason to presume that everything in this universe isn't or hasn't already played out in the exact way in another one of these infinite universes.
And in an infinite number of different ways.
Correct. And so that is what comes out of the equations. So that makes the Big Bang a kind of a small part of a much larger whole. And so, yeah, we're ready for that.
All right, that's that. Thank you so much for joining me on this. I'd love to hear some of your astronomical questions about what you think the future of the universe entails, unless it has already happened.